Welcome to our 8th lecture for the fall series for EEE. Thanks for coming out on this kind of gloomy day. Today we have Lauren Hierl and is it John Groveman from the VNRC. Lauren Hierl joined VNRC as Executive Director in August of 2024. She previously served as Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters, a position she assumed in 2018 after working for 4 years as their political director. Prior to that, Lauren worked for 2 years as environmental health advocate at the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, VPIRG. She spent the previous decade working as an environmental advocate in Washington, D.C. at National Audubon Society and Alaska Wilderness League. Lauren received her Master of Environmental Management and Master of Public Policy degrees at Duke University and her bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College. John Groveman has served as the Policy and Water Program Director at VNRC since 2016, having rejoined the organization after a previous stint as General Counsel and Water Program Director. In 2011, John was tapped to serve as General Counsel for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources and was later appointed to chair the Natural Resources Board, NRB, which administers Vermont's statewide land use program, Act 250. Before joining VNRC in 2004, John served as Director of the Vermont Water Resources Board, Director of the Law Center for the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, Act 250 Land Use Attorney for the State of Vermont, and in the Legislative and Legal Affairs Department of the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. John received a BA in Psychology from SUNY Binghamton and his JD from Quinnipiac College School of Law. I got it. So without further ado, please welcome John and Lauren. Thank you.
So thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for inviting us to come speak with you today about PFAS chemicals. Again, my name is Lauren Hierl, and I'm the Executive Director of VNRC. And VNRC is a statewide nonprofit that's been around since 1963. And our mission is to ensure a healthy environment and resilient communities for all Vermonters now and into the future. And you can see we're talking about addressing toxic PFAS contamination, and toxic chemical issues are something I've been working on for about a dozen years. So it's one of my core areas of focus, and I'm really excited that you all wanted to come learn more today. It's really important and concerning issue, but Vermont has been doing a lot, so excited to talk to you about it. And I'll have John introduce himself briefly. Anything you want to add?
Welcome, everybody. It's really great to be here. No, that was the longest introduction. I didn't think my whole resume would be read, so I'm a little embarrassed, and clearly I can't hold a job.
Okay. See if I can get my computer working. There we go. All right, so before we get into what Vermont's been doing, let's just ground ourselves in what are PFAS. So PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which I'll never say again today, just PFAS. So they're known as forever chemicals. They are this class of chemicals that includes, current estimates are 12 to 15,000 different chemicals within this class. And they're known as forever chemicals because they last in the environment indefinitely. The core part of them is they have this carbon-fluorine bond, which is the strongest bond in organic chemistry, and because of that, they don't break down easily. So once you have these chemicals in the environment, they continue to cause ongoing problems. And it's because of this bond that they have these special properties that make really good waterproofing, grease-proofing. So if you think about your Gore-Tex boots or your Teflon pan, that's the property that that chemical bond creates, and it's why they've been used in a ton of different products. So all kinds of, you can see up here, kind of, it's a little hard to read it, but clothing, cookware, we'll get into, range of products, but they become really widespread because of these qualities that they have. And unfortunately, they are linked to a range of harms to human health, including things like thyroid disease, certain cancers, high cholesterol, immune system impacts, reproductive and developmental disorders. And these health impacts occur at really low levels of exposure. So, for example, the way that we kind of measure how we try to regulate these chemicals is in this kind of wonky parts per trillion. And so if you think about 1 drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools, just that level of PFAS chemical is considered toxic in water. And so at really low levels, these chemicals can cause significant health impacts. And surveys by the CDC have found PFAS chemicals in the blood of just about every single American. And they're even found in high levels in polar bears and wildlife all over the globe. It's because, again, they're so persistent and also very mobile, so they move through the environment easily. So they've created this just global contamination issue. And they create contamination issues from the beginning of when they're manufactured to, when the product we're done with it. So, the factory that first manufactures the chemicals, you can have contamination issues. A company that then uses PFAS as an ingredient in their product, another site of potential contamination. Then we bring the products into our home, so then you can have exposure in that way. When you're using a product, maybe some of it's washing down the drain, it's getting into our wastewater treatment facilities, flowing into our rivers. When we throw the product that we're using that contains PFAS out, it goes to the landfill, which we've seen PFAS contamination issues at landfills, including at Coventry here in Vermont. And then landfills produce this stuff called leachate, garbage juice, that then needs to be treated. That's high in PFAS. That goes to my hometown of Montpelier right now in Vermont, and that creates another contamination site. There was a small-scale study that the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation did looking at wastewater treatment facilities, and every single one in Vermont had some level of PFAS. The one that took leachate had the highest. But just all this washing down of PFAS from our homes and businesses and schools, all the products, is getting into our wastewater that's then going into our rivers, into Lake Champlain. And also the sludge from those is applied sometimes to farm fields and creates other zones. So because of the way these chemicals move, it's just this massive contamination issue. And at this point, we're really Debbie Downers. Sorry. So at this point, when we've looked at PFAS contamination across the U.S., we see this huge scope of the problem. So right now, this was as of August 14th, 2025, this was estimating that about 172 million Americans had drinking water that detected PFAS in it. So massive national and global problem. We've also come to learn over time that the companies who make these chemicals hid and lied about the toxicity of them for decades. Going back even as early as the 50s, there were concerning indicators in studies, and through the decades, they learned more and more about how these chemicals were toxic, seeing impacts of their workers and a number of studies on animals, but they hid it, and they were kind of marketing aggressively. Your Teflon pan, there's the ads with the smiling woman and the egg slipping right off it, and these are a miracle product. And like decades after they knew that these chemicals were toxic at extremely low levels, and they continue to fight us at the Vermont State House about about these chemicals. If people haven't seen, there's a couple really great movies about this. There's a movie that Mark Ruffalo stars in called Dark Waters that kind of tells the story. So recommend that if you want to go down this rabbit hole. Or there was a really great documentary called The Devil We Know that it really follows some of the families of women, especially who had worked on the lines at one of the manufacturing facilities for PFAS. And they had children with severe birth defects, but they were like a number of these women all had the same birth defects, and the company just hid it, lied about it, shunted them aside. So lots of like really bad history here of the chemicals. But back in 2016, PFOA, one of these PFAS chemicals, was discovered in the drinking water wells in North Bennington, Vermont. And we were hearing reports in Hoosick Falls, not far from Bennington, and a couple other places. But really, Vermont was one of the early discoveries of this type of contamination in the country. And it came from a local manufacturer that was applying Teflon to fabric. It was the kind of thing used for like sports arena ceilings. It's this waterproof fabric. But when this discovery came out, it was really devastating for the community. You know, we all think we have, you know, great clean water here in Vermont, and to learn that they had this contaminated water, you know, that there was a lot of public meetings. I remember at one of them, this pregnant woman sobbing in my friend's arms because she was like, I thought it was being so good. I've been drinking so much water. I thought it was so good for my baby, but instead I've been exposing them to this toxic chemical. And just, you know, having people have to live with that kind of contamination was obviously very upsetting. And the Vermont legislature was you know, really concerned immediately and actually stepped up quickly to establish a chemical use working group. And they wanted to really understand, you know, again, this was not something that was widely known at the time. So they wanted to kind of get their arms around, you know, what is this problem? What's the scope of it? What can we do about it as a state? They created this chemical use working group. I was appointed to it as an environmental community rep. There were industry groups, scientists, administration officials, and we were really on the steep part of the learning curve because we were like, what are PFAS? But we basically came out with this kind of suite of recommendations, and it's really guided a lot of the work that's happened in the almost decade since that group came together. And it looked at kind of three big buckets of work. One was bans. How do we stop importing this chemical into our state? Another was corporate accountability. How do we hold the manufacturers of these chemicals responsible? And how do we help people who have been harmed by toxic PFAS exposure? And then what can the state do to improve monitoring, you know, understanding the scope of the problem, testing, you know, and helping provide relief for people who have been harmed? So I'm now going to turn over to John, who's going to talk about some of the corporate accountability pieces.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So I'm going to talk about. Turn it off. Can you hear me? That's back on. I'm going to talk about the accountability part of the recommendations from this report, but also the water. Some of the actions that the state has taken, and they took right away to deal with water contamination from PFAS. So as Lauren said, it's really important to understand that PFAS was not, and this just goes to the faults in the system for regulating chemicals in this country. You know, I think most people would assume that just like, you know, with the FDA, that drugs don't go onto the market unless they're tested and they're trials and, you know, so on, and it's safe by the time you go to the pharmacy to get your drug. It's been, you know, it's scientists have basically deemed it to be safe to take. And I think a lot of people feel that's the same way it probably works with toxic chemicals. You just can't, you know, a chemical manufacturer can't create a new chemical for use in commerce and put it out there to be used without knowing it's safe. And that's not the way our chemical system has worked. And that's a whole other subject of TSCA. And I think, are you going to come back and you're going to talk about TSCA a little bit? You want? But so when the PFAS release happened in Vermont, we had no standard for PFAS in drinking water, no standard for PFAS in surface water. PFAS was not considered a dangerous substance that, if released, would have to be cleaned up under the Superfund programs. Have you all heard of like the federal Superfund law? When there's a contaminated site, the federal program, it's known as CERCLA, is the federal law. Under CERCLA, the government can use an actual fund to clean up the site, actually could go to court and hold polluters liable. So PFAS was not, no PFAS was listed as a hazardous substance that would trigger the Superfund. And most states, including Vermont, have their own state Superfund program, and PFAS was not listed as a hazardous waste in Vermont as well. So right after the incident in Bennington, to the state's credit, they had an emergency rule and they adopted a drinking water standard for PFOA and PFAS, which are two of the PFAS compounds. And I think Lauren said this, but there are literally thousands, there are tens of thousands of PFAS compounds. So the two, PFOS and PFAS, those were the ones that were found in Bennington to contaminate the water and the soil there. So those were the ones that the state immediately adopted a drinking water standard for, and the drinking water standard was 20 parts per trillion, to Lauren's point about how little amounts we're talking about to be harmful. EPA did know that PFAS might be harmful for more than a decade, and EPA did have an advisory that if drinking water systems or private wells had PFAS in the amounts of more than 100 parts per trillion, that could be dangerous, but there was no standard. EPA did not regulate any of the PFAS chemicals in drinking water, either in public water systems, public water supply systems, or in private wells. So Vermont immediately did that. Vermont also listed PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances. So under our state Superfund program, the state could then go after contamination of PFAS, and that's what they did in Bennington. So they listed those two PFAS compounds as hazardous substances, and the Attorney General immediately sued the company that released the PFAS in Bennington. And it took a couple of years, but over a period of a couple of years, the state reached a settlement with the company, which is Saint-Gobain, was the company that owned the factory at the time in Bennington. And they had to pay to basically run the public water system in Bennington to the people whose wells were harmed. There were hundreds and hundreds of people in Bennington whose wells had, we're talking about, right, 20 parts per trillion was the Vermont standard, had hundreds of parts per trillion in their well water, had soils that were incredibly contaminated, hundreds of parts per trillion with PFAS. So that we had to get, job one was to get potable, clean, safe drinking water to those people, and that's what the state of Vermont did. So that was really good. So those are two things that happened immediately at the state of Vermont. The feds move slower, as they tend to do, even under administrations that are better on environmental protection than other administrations. But at the very end of the Biden administration proposed a national drinking water standard for 5 PFAS compounds. So again, there are, is it like 20,000? Is that what the number is? 12 to 15, there's 12. And that's important because, so if you have a standard for drinking water for 5 of these compounds, so PFOS, PFAS, I can't say the other 3 names, some of them have like multiple letters in them, but but it's basically the P and the F, as Lauren said, right? It starts with those. You could then create another chemical that will also could be used as Teflon, and pans could be used as Gore-Tex, and those end up not being regulated. So we've actually argued as an environmental advocacy group, along with environmental groups around the country, that we should be regulating the whole class of these chemicals, right? So it was great that Vermont adopted a drinking water standard for those 2 and listed those 2 as a hazardous substance, so then that triggers the state Superfund program and we could actually get accountability. But we really need to deal with the class, right, of PFAS. Otherwise, what are we doing? It's kind of like, we call it like whack-a-mole. Like, you deal with these 2 and then 5 more spring up, and then you deal with those 5 and then 5 other ones spring up. But we were grateful that the Biden administration finally, after more than a decade now, so this happened in Bennington in 2016, that was 10 years ago. So it was more than a decade when we started to see this contamination, that they did adopt a drinking water standard for these 5. I think the standard for PFOS and PFAS was 4 parts per trillion. And then for the other 3 that I'm not going to try to say their names, I think they were, I have written down here, it was 10 parts per trillion. So lower than even the Vermont standard. And just last week, the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources is proposing a rule to adopt that Biden drinking water standard for those 5 PFAS. So that's really good. That rule actually is out for public comment now. If you want to go, we could send a link too, but if you want to go to the Agency of Natural Resources website, you can see the proposed rule. You can comment. You can comment that, thank you for doing this. We support this rule. You could say, add the whole class of PFAS if you want to get into it and you really want to go there. But it's a step in the right direction. The Trump administration, they've rolled back a lot of environmental regulations, and you can have a whole lecture on that, and maybe you've had and maybe you will. But they actually are keeping the drinking water standard for PFOS and PFAS. They're going to delay it a little bit, but they are going to keep it. But they're getting rid of the drinking water standard for the other 3 compounds, which I can't pronounce because they're just too chemically complex in their nomenclature. So really important for the states to be acting, I think, always on this, but especially at a time when the federal government is not doing enough to protect basic environmental protections like drinking water safety, right? The last thing I'll say about the drinking water standard is that, so EPA, they set the standard, so that's like what you have to meet if you're a public water supply. And I should say also, this doesn't, if you have a private well, you need to test your own water. This is only for public water supplies. So South Burlington obviously is public water supply. Anybody who's on the water supply in South Burlington, they'll have to test for the 5 compounds of PFAS that are regulated. They'll have to meet that limit. If they don't, the water supply is going to have to treat the water. You have a private well, it's up to you to treat it. There's no standard. You hire someone to drill your well, and that it's really on you as a private citizen. So that's just another issue that you should be aware of. But it's important to note that EPA, in setting the drinking water standard, they also set a goal. So there's a standard that the water supplies have to meet, but then they say, well, what are the safety concerns and what is the goal? And the goal for PFAS chemicals is 0. So basically, EPA is saying that actually not 1 iota of PFAS is really safe. We're going to set it at 4 or 10 because we think that is reasonable given the cost of treating and the risk of some sort of risk analysis. But they're really saying that the science shows that none of it is safe. So the last thing I want to talk, so those are some things that Vermont has done. There's been a lot of talk in Vermont and around the country about surface water standards for PFAS. So obviously drinking water is the most concerning because, as Lauren said, it's so dangerous and you're putting it right in your body. But we have a lot of PFAS in our rivers and streams and lakes and ponds. And as Lauren said, a lot of it gets discharged through wastewater plants all over the state, and that every plant we've tested has some level of PFAS in it. And we have no standard right now. We have no water quality standard for PFAS in Vermont. A wastewater plant can discharge any amount of PFAS right now, and it's legal. And their permits do not require testing for PFAS, and they don't require treatment for PFAS. So we've been arguing for that. EPA, right before the Biden administration left, put out some guidance on how wastewater treatment plants throughout the country could test and then have a treatment standard for PFAS. And that was going to be the first step towards working towards like getting an actual surface water standard. But if the Trump administration is not moving forward with that. So that's something that we're working on at VNRC with some of our partner groups, is going to the legislature and advocating that we need a surface water standard, that we could achieve it. There's actually a law in the books in Vermont that requires the Agency of Natural Resources to adopt a surface water standard. They haven't done it. So they're actually violating the law right now. So we're looking at also legal options. I acknowledge that it's a little trickier to determine the health risks of swimming in water with PFAS as opposed to like drinking it. As I said, I think it's common sense, but there's certainly negative impacts. I don't think anyone wants to have contact if they're swimming with water with PFAS in it. If they're boating, certainly fish consume the water with PFAS, and if you consume fish from the water. So all of these are issues of concern, and we are working with the legislature and the Agency of Natural Resources to try to address them. And so the last thing I'll say in terms of accountability, what the state has done is, so when the PFAS release came, the Attorney General in Vermont and Attorney Generals all around the country have sued the manufacturers of these chemicals, right? So where does this start with? It starts with the companies that made these chemicals, and Lauren showed the chart that showed, you know, how these companies knew decades and decades ago how harmful they were. DuPont and 3M are the two major chemical companies that we're talking about. So there have been lawsuits to sue these companies to say, you knew or you should have known how harmful these chemicals are. Now you've harmed people's drinking water supplies. You've harmed public water supplies that need tens of millions of dollars to be upgraded. You are going to cause wastewater plants to have to treat for this chemical at some point. You have to pay those costs. And so those lawsuits are going, and we passed a bill in Vermont a couple years ago that VNRC advocated for that made it easier to sue chemical manufacturers. We actually wrote right into our statute, you could sue those manufacturers under civil liability, you know, basically arguing that they were acting in a fraudulent way by hiding information. So think about like the lawsuits against like the tobacco companies, it's kind of like that. But we actually wrote into our statutes that the state of Vermont can sue chemical manufacturers if there is a finding of contamination of a chemical that has harmed natural resources or public health. So we made it easier. Some states have adopted our approach. It just makes it easier. Suing any, you know, getting into a litigation is always difficult. Getting into litigation with these giant chemical companies that have more money than, or as much money as any entity, any corporation in this country is incredibly hard. So any obstacle that you could take out of the way is good. And so we did that in the state of Vermont. And then, you know, in addition to the state taking action like it did in Bennington using our state Superfund law, or the AG now suing the manufacturers to get further compensation for the harm that these chemicals have caused in Vermont, individuals end up suing, right? So those people in Bennington, they had personal injury, right? They got sick. Some people died. Their property values plummeted, right? They had property that had soil that was completely contaminated with PFAS. So people's largest asset, their home, their property was worth much less. So there was a class action suit that was brought by that class of people, the people in Bennington who were harmed in this way, and that is like a civil suit. And this is you know, think the Civil Action movie, like with John Travolta from years ago. We could just do like a whole movie review. So that's a great, you know, or Erin Brockovich. It's all the same issue, right? There's these chemicals, you know, in this case it's PFAS. They cause all this harm. You want to sue to make people whole. We realized that in bringing these suits, one issue that legally couldn't be brought up is this issue of getting monitored for PFAS in your body. The way that civil liability law generally works is that you can only sue once you're sick, once you're harmed, right? So if you consume the PFAS and you've gotten sick, you've gotten some terrible disease, you're harmed, you can join that class action. You can be part of that suit, and if you're successful, you could get money and compensation. But if you have really high levels of PFAS in your body because you've been drinking the water, but you're not sick yet, you can't sue for that. You couldn't be part of that lawsuit. So in Vermont, it took us 4 or 5 years, 3 governor vetoes, 2, to basically write into our statutes, and we're the first state to have in our statute that you can sue for medical monitoring. So if you have been exposed to PFAS and you go to the doctor and they do a blood test on you and you have high levels, you could sue to get money to go to the doctor, get your medical bills paid, to try to make sure you don't get sick, right? It's prevention, right? So we wrote that into the law. And we've been talking about for years, the standard when you bring these lawsuits is negligence, which is, the typical, you have to prove that not only someone hurt you, but they acted unreasonably, right? So we'd have a whole debate about what the companies knew, when did they know it, was it reasonable? And even though I think, there are good facts in this situation, again, you're going up against really well-resourced companies, and they will fight in every legal front they can. So they will argue that they acted reasonably, they didn't really know, or nobody knew how harmful this stuff was. So we really would like to see a standard of what's called strict liability in Vermont for these lawsuits. So if you do consume or have contact with PFAS and you're hurt, all you have to prove is that somebody released the PFAS or put the PFAS out into commerce, if you're talking about the companies, and you're harmed, whether it's because you have high levels of PFAS in your blood or you've become sick, and then you could recover. Then you're just onto the damages phase. That's all you're arguing about. So if you could prove those two simple things, and you could just get to how much money do those companies need to pay you to make you whole for the harm that they caused you. We're a long ways away from that. We get this. Corporations do not like this idea of strict liability. It really puts them on the line. It makes it, the risk much higher when they put anything out in commerce. That's the point, though, from our perspective. Like, since the government is not protecting us through their regulatory programs, make the liability risk much higher for these companies. And that would be a motivation for them to be more cautious and conservative about this. But we have this on our agenda. It's not on this year's agenda. We need a more favorable political climate, I think. But we will, before I'm done, which could be next week. As far as I could tell. Well, if it's not next week, we'll keep fighting for this. And then whoever comes after me, Lauren, I hope you'll hire someone that we'll fight for this. And you can hire me as a consultant, but if you want to. But that's my part I wanted to cover. Do you have some more? You have a limit.
Thank you. All right. This was just showing that there's, a number of states around the country that have adopted drinking water standards, but a bunch that haven't. So right now, a lot of states are in limbo, but, Vermont, John described well kind of where we are. So the other area of work that had been, identified as a core priority back with that stakeholder group was we really need to turn off the tap of bringing these PFAS chemicals into the state. As I described, any more PFAS you're bringing in creates these long-term and cyclical problems that we're going to have to deal with. So, going upstream and just saying, let's just have less PFAS in products that we're bringing into the state is a great preventative step. And so that's been a big area of focus for VNRC. And over the past 3 years, Vermont has really been a national leader in this space. And each of the past 3 years, we've passed bills to ban PFAS from different product categories. So in 2023, we were able to work with state lawmakers to ban PFAS from food packaging. So PFAS are used in like grease-proofing pizza boxes and wrappers of different things, a bunch of different food packaging applications. We banned it from stain and water-resistant treatments. So this is things like Scotch Guard that you might spray on something, or sometimes they'll treat your couch or your rug to be stain-resistant. That can contain PFAS. Also, rugs and carpets themselves we banned PFAS from. Sometimes it's just applied directly into them. And also ski wax. And we've seen actually in a number of Vermont ski communities that there's higher levels of PFAS that we hypothesize is because there's a lot of skiing happening, and all of that wax that's applied, some of it contains PFAS. And so we banned PFAS from ski wax as well. The next year, we expanded the ban to cover cosmetics and menstrual products. So, a lot of things like, think your like waterproof mascara, some lipsticks had PFAS, a bunch of different products in that space. We also banned it from firefighting foam and equipment. And firefighting foam has been a real big problem all around the country, between like just the amount, if you think of, there's a lot of PFAS and the amount of foam that it was sprayed to put out big fires, and especially at things like airports and Department of Defense sites where they're doing also a lot of training. They have, there's huge contamination issues. Even like the South Burlington Airport and the Rutland Airport both had some associated contamination issues because of PFAS use at the airports. We also expanded the ban to cover textiles and apparel. So again, like your Gore-Tex boot or your waterproof jacket could contain PFAS. So that we're transitioning away from. Artificial turf, so those turf fields, we learned in this process that they would basically coat like to make the nice little grass things, they would coat the machines that they would make that in PFAS, so it would go through more easily, and that was meaning that the final product contained a lot of PFAS, so we banned it from that. And then also from juvenile products, so things marketed to children under 12, and also cookware. So back to the classic Teflon pan. And that is still an ongoing active fight all over the country. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to me because the cookware industry, or the people who are the PFAS portion of the cookware industry are like, there's no alternatives. We can't do this. And we're like, there's cast iron, there's aluminum, there's stainless steel. Like, yes, there are alternatives, but they are like amazingly, it's a very aggressive lobby that even in California this year, a bill was vetoed by Governor Newsom that would have banned PFAS from cookware because the intensity of this lobbying effort. But we have banned it, and it's not phased in yet in Vermont. But don't use Teflon pans, please. And then this year we expanded the ban to firefighting turnout gear, dental floss, a lot of which currently has PFAS. Fluorinated containers, which is just like a lot of different types of containers they coat in PFAS, and then the PFAS leach into different types of products. And then finally, cleaning products, where we also saw them. So we work with groups all over the country who share our goals about reducing people's toxic exposure. And you can see that states all around the country and all kinds of states have taken action on PFAS and have banned PFAS from various product categories. Some states have taken a more comprehensive approach. So for example, Maine and Minnesota put in place, basically banned PFAS from all consumer products, but then they have a process for companies to get exceptions if there's no alternative. So Vermont has not taken that approach because it takes a lot of state government resources to figure out like which companies deserve this type of exception. So we're kind of letting them do that work, and we're continuing to push on banning from product categories as we go, but definitely try to coordinate. And it's really kind of fun to see that like little Vermont can make a huge difference in this space. What we've learned over time and working on PFAS and other toxic chemical issues is, these big companies don't make a different product for Vermont if we have a ban than for other states. And so we alone can help push the market to actually make the transition. They're kind of like, once one state bans it, other states start to ban it, kind of the writing's on the wall. So we can have this really outsized impact, even as a little state, to move the market and to inspire other states to take action. Let's see. So, did you want to talk about this, John? The federal threat? Or do you want me to? So essentially at this point, there is an effort just to get on your radar right now so federally, John was describing the Toxic Substances Control Act, so TSCA, which is like the driving federal chemical regulatory system that we have, has a lot of shortcomings. It was updated in 2016, so at least now for new chemicals coming onto the market, there is more requirements for testing and demonstrating safety. A bunch of chemicals were grandfathered in, so that's still an ongoing problem. But right now there's a big push to actually open up that law by the chemical industry to, they really don't like that they have to do this testing ahead of time now. And so they're trying to open it up. And for some reason, there's like some interest from people to actually do that, including some of the Democratic folks in the Senate, in the U.S. Senate. And so, we're watching closely. And one of the provisions that would be particularly damaging is preempting states from taking action. So the chemical industry really wants to stop states like Vermont from doing all the things we've been talking about today. And so they've been pushing for this for years. Maybe they, have a more favorable political context to push for that now. So we're going to be, weighing in, trying to make sure that that doesn't move forward. But it's a threat that we're kind of watching and concerned about right now. And, for us, the states are really who have led on this. The federal government has followed the state's leads. When we take action, it has demonstrated that the markets can shift, the innovation happens, and it makes it easier for them then to step in. So as John described, the drinking water standards, a number of states had those long before the federal government did, and it just makes it easier. So we're really focused on trying to make sure we preserve the right of states to act to protect ourselves from these toxic chemicals. But, as you can see, this is a really challenging issue and a lot going on and a lot more work to do. So we're going to continue looking at things like continuing to ban PFAS from other product categories. There's still more work to do there. As John mentioned, strict liability, looking at, how do we make sure that chemical companies who made these products and knew they were harmful and have made untold billions of dollars profiting off them are the ones, ultimately held responsible to help clean up the billions of dollars of mess that they've made in our communities. So lots more work to do, but we're grateful for you all coming today. That the one on the right is my kiddo that this was, this poor kid has been at so many, so many events, but at the State House. But at this point, we would love to take your questions. Do you want to come up, John?
If you have a question, you raise your hand. I'll bring the mic over to you. She'll get you on that side.
Are these chemicals manufactured, or does it start out in the environment and that you put things together? And the second question is, can you cleanse your body from having been exposed?
So these are industrial-made chemicals, so it's not something that occurs in nature. So they're made in labs. There's no naturally occurring PFAS, all man-made compounds. The second one, I don't know of any technologies yet. I know people are looking at that. They're looking at things like bacteria and things that can eat it. So I think people are trying to see if there's ways, if you do have high levels of PFAS in your body, to address it. But at this point, there's no known solution. So that's why we're so focused on how do we just stop the flow of it. Question here.
What are the products in schools that we're getting these astronomical figures in schools? What is it about the schools that is it sheetrock? Is it whiteboards? Do you know?
You might be thinking about the PCBs in schools. So that's another toxic chemical issue that the PCBs were used in a lot of manufacturing products like caulking and a bunch of different things. John can talk about that.
There was in the study of, Lauren mentioned there was a study of wastewater systems in Vermont, and they all had PFAS, but they also studied the water supply systems as part of that same study, and schools had high levels of PFAS in their drinking water, and they believe it was because it's in the wax of the gym and the cafeteria. You know how slippery school floors are? That was what the state was assuming, that it was all PFAS was going down the drain and going into the water and wastewater system.
how can you responsibly dispose of products with PFAS? How can consumers educate themselves about which products contain PFAS?
This is a tough one because there's not at this point really a good solution. So, people are just still throwing them away in the regular trash. Right now, Casella at the Coventry landfill, for example, has been doing a pilot study trying to figure out how, I talked about the leachate that then right now gets shipped off site and contains the PFAS. So, if you're throwing it away to the landfill, you're exacerbating that problem. The pilot study they've done of a system, it was like this foam that would attract the PFAS. It did work for some of the PFAS compounds, but not other ones. So I think hasn't been a huge success by my estimation, but people are kind of looking at, if we are throwing it away at landfills, how do we at least stop the contamination from spreading beyond that? But there's really not a great solution now. I don't know, John, if you.
No, this is why we got to get it out of the waste stream. Because they don't break down. I think we're stuck with these chemicals that we have for a really long time, if not forever.
How can we choose which dental floss to buy? I mean, simple questions. They're not labeled on there as PFAS containing. And is it all non-sticks cookware that we have to get rid of?
So the dental floss right now is tricky. Our ban on PFAS in floss, I think, doesn't go into effect for another year or so. I mean, sometimes it will, like the ones that are like the Glide and the, that are like the super smooth, you can assume is probably PFAS. So some of like the waxed that are, you've got a better bet. But it is that this is part of the challenge is that, most consumer products don't have a label. So it's this, we're always like, people shouldn't have to shop around these chemicals. And so that's why we need to do the bans and not, for cookware, at this point, any of the, a lot of like the non-stick, some of them claim to be PFAS free, but do contain a certain type of PFAS. So if it looks like an old school Teflon pan, but is claiming to be PFAS free, I would, use caution. This is where it's like cast iron. Some of the ceramics seem to be okay and are pretty nonstick as far as we know right now. And, your stainless steel and all of that are safer bets at this point.
Yeah. What will it do to my body? I mean, how do I know that when will I know that I've been attacked by PFAS, essentially? It's already happened.
I mean, you could have a blood test if you wanted to know.
But what is the nature of the damage to my body that it will do?
I think
So, I mean, part of the problem with these is they impact a whole bunch of different body systems. So, I mean, if I can go back to the health slide. So, they affect your immune system. They affect developmental issues. So a lot of like reproductive system issues, thyroid and endocrine system. Certain cancers are linked to it, kidney and testicular in particular. So, I mean, if you got a condition that, is linked to, which you can find online, the condition's linked to it, and you wanted to then test your blood and see, could this have been from PFAS? You could do that, but it's hard. Like, this is where all these chemical issues are tricky because it's, there's so many different causes, but this is where we're like, we got to stop getting us all exposed to this which just increases the risk of these types of health impacts.
But the conditions itemized up there have been studies such that determine a direct correlation between the PFAS and the...
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, increased risk of these health conditions from exposure to PFAS.
Yeah, and the way it comes out is that, like, when we talked about, when you've been exposed at high levels, and then you get your blood tested and you have high levels, and then you have one of these diseases. That's how, like, the studies have been able to show. So it really does test your water, test, if you want to get a blood test. But I mean, that's kind of how we know. But everyone has PFAS in them. We all of us do at some level.
Are there product labeling laws requiring disclosure of PFAS in retail products?
No labeling laws that I am aware of. Really, again, it's been trying to do the restrictions because we don't want any products on our store shelves that contain these. We have pursued labeling laws in some cases, but we've really focused on the bans because we just want to get them out.
Would it be worth giving him a link to like the Mind the Store people? Like, because like one of the groups we work with, while there are no labeling laws, they've worked to get certain retailers and manufacturers of products to agree not to use PFAS. So like, for example, like I think REI is like a recent one. So there is a list. We could send a link to this group that links the retailers that have agreed to not sell products with PFAS.
And one other resource, there are groups like the Environmental Working Group that does a lot of product testing and posts. So they've got on their website where you can search for a bunch of different products. And if they've tested, it's been a lot of like cosmetics and sunscreens and things like that. But that can be a resource too, where they have tested for a lot of these chemicals. So, if you want to research safer alternatives, there's some online resources.
Question. Thank you for the very informative presentation. I have a product category in mind, which is those bottles of water like Poland Spring, and there are many labels, that I wonder about the ability to extract pollutants, the PFAS, or testing marketed water like that, which is interstate kind of commerce. I wish you'd address that particular product category.
So how is bottled water dealt with? Like, the
Do
bottles like this, are they
do they
testing it?
Yes, do they test for it? Do they remove it when they find it?
Depends on the state. I know. Yeah.
It's plastic and there are chemicals, and there's been studies about just when those bottles heat up, all of the chemicals that are in them leach into the water. And so don't leave them like in your car or a hot place, But I don't know about PFAS specific, but it's not good. I mean,
the water, again, I showed the map of different states have different water requirements. So maybe the source of where it comes from, Poland Spring theoretically from Maine. So they have a drinking water standards, or they might be testing for it.
Yeah, that's a whole other ball of wax.
Sometimes bottled water has different testing protocols than like public water supplies. It's actually not as stringent as public drinking water supplies. So there could be a loophole there. That's a good flag. Other questions?
Thank you. So would you be able to share the links to all of your wonderful slides with us after the presentation? That would be helpful. We could actually sit down and go through it again, and I could see it, from way back here. That would be great. It's a lot of good information.
Definitely can send our slides, which then can be shared, and in the email could share a couple of these links to some of these sites that we've mentioned as well, for sure.
All right. Well, if that's all the questions, I think we can wrap this up. Thanks a lot, Lauren and John.